First, thank you for inviting us to give this talk. And following the insightful introduction given by Lolly just now, I will present our recent studies on the neurodynamics of incremental speech comprehension. So as we know, and also this is what Lolly just mentioned, speech comprehension involves the transition from the sound wave into a meaningful interpretation. This occurs millisecond by millisecond, word by word, and everywhere in our daily life with remarkable speed and efficiency. And the key to this transition is the incremental processes involved in combining different types of lexical contents. Specifically, each word's meaning is activated and integrated with the prior context as the speech unfolds word by word. Moreover, instead of simple linear concatenations, the meanings of words are combined in terms of the structure embedded in a sentence. So after hearing the mother of this naughty boy holds an apple, a listener can immediately figure out the one who holds the apple is the mother instead of the boy. So although boy and holds are linearly close in the speech input, the meanings of structurally close words, mother and holds are combined. So the speech sound we perceive is linearly word by word delivered, but its meaning is often structured in a discontinuous way, as shown by the dependency path tree on the right. So how is incremental speech comprehension achieved in the brain? What are the neurobiological systems involved, and what are the neurodynamics supporting the word-by-word meaning computation? These are the broad questions we want to address. Relevant to these, we asked two specific questions in the studies I'm going to present. First, how are the meanings of two structurally proximate words composed in the brain? That is, two words that are directly connected in the path tree, such as hose and apple. Secondly, how does the brain build a structured interpretation from an unfolding sentence? So this goes beyond two words and involves different types of lexical properties that might be considered in sentence comprehension, where both linguistic and broad word knowledge come into play. Okay, to address these questions, we need to first be able to track the fleeting brain activity on millisecond scales during speech comprehension. So we use simultaneous EEG and MEG to record participants' brain activity while they were listening to natural speech. So both EEG and MEG directly record neural activity in a non-invasive way. One records the electrical signal, the other records the magnetic signal. And with source localization, we can also locate the neural activity of interest with fairly good spatial resolution. So in short, source-localized EEG MEG enable us to track a listener's brain activity millisecond by millisecond. So besides spatiotemporally resolved brain activity, we also need models that can quantify the different kinds of representations and the processes involved in speech comprehension. So based on these models, we can derive quantitative measures and relate them to brain data. This enables us to explicitly probe the neurodynamics supporting speech comprehension, as well as other cognitive functions. So this is also the main idea of cognitive computational neuroscience. So in our studies, we use different types of computational language models to reveal the neurodynamics of speech comprehension, such as feature norms, topic modeling, and other word embeddings, and artificial neural networks trained for natural language processing. So speaking of ANNs, significant advances have been made in AI systems that can do language comprehension and production tasks. So look at these headlines and tweets saying human can't even tell whether an article is written by ANNs, and ANNs can write like a lawyer, ANNs can write codes. So here is also a little teasing from Hinton, one of the godfathers of deep learning, saying that the answer to life using words and everything is just 4 trillion parameters. So while such powerful ANNs seems unattractive to help us investigate how the brain comprehends language, but it's also clear that similar outputs or behaviors do not guarantee the existence of similar mechanisms. we have to first conduct in-depth comparison between the internal operations of humans and machines. We need empirical evidence to tell the extent to which ANs represent and process language like the human brain. So in fact, the parallels between the human brain and ANs have already been studied for quite a while. For example, the hidden states of visual AN can well explain the neural activity in primate visual system. However, to what extent the language ANs match human brain activity is still an open question. So we tried to investigate the relationship between the brain and ANs in language comprehension in the second study in this talk. Okay, let's get back to our specific questions on the neurodynamics of incremental speech comprehension. So here, the first one is about meaning computation of two structurally proximate words, the syntactically licensed semantic combination between two words directly connected in a path tree, so such as hose and apple. In this study, we hope to give a more detailed explanation of the neurobiological basis of rapid integration during speech comprehension. So we focus on the meaning computation of a verb and a starter object noun, which are structurally close to each other. So as we know, different verbs usually have different semantic constraints. For example, eat prefers something edible, while hold prefers something small or less, something you can put in your hand. So will the same noun apple be interpreted in the same way when it's preceded by different verbs, or will it be interpreted differently? So this also speaks to the issue about how and whether word meanings are flexibly interpreted in the context where they occur, or whether they have context-independent core meaning that is always activated. So in this experiment, we selected 120 concrete nouns. Each could be preceded by 3 different verbs with varying semantic constraints. For example, eat, hold, and want. To create a more natural speech environment, we put each verb and noun pair after a very simple subject-noun phrase, such as the older man ate the apple. We recorded the participants' brain activity while they were listening to these sentences. So the first question is how to model the meaning of a word. According to the distributional hypothesis of semantics, the meaning of a word could be inferred from the context where it occurs. So if you know whether it's suitable to put a word in a certain context, you should probably know the meaning of this word. In practice, a word's context can be quantified by its co-occurrence with other words. So here the x-axis indicates all the direct object nouns in the corpora, and the y-axis is the co-occurrence frequency between a verb and its dual nouns. For example, the nouns most frequently co-occurs with eat are food, meat, meal, which captures its semantic constraints for edible things. Based on such verb and noun co-occurrence, we conducted topic modeling. So this resulted in 200 hidden semantic topics and 2 levels of probabilistic distributions. So each verb can be represented as a distribution over 200 semantic topics, while each topic itself is another distribution over the whole vocabulary of nouns. So for example, in the topic distribution of hold, one topic it prefers is about things that are light or small. So this topic captures one meaning of hold, which is to have something in your hand. Well, another topic it prefers is something like a meeting or conference. So it captures another meaning of hold, which is to have an event. As for the topic distribution of eat, it seems that there is only one dominant topic, which is about edible things. So with these topic modeling results, the semantic constraints of a verb can be modeled as a verb topic vector, which is a probabilistic distribution over all the topics given this verb. Similarly, non-semantics can be modeled by a non-topic vector. So to model the meaning computation between a verb and its object noun, we conducted the element-by-element multiplication between each pair of verb topic vector and non-topic vector. So this resulted in a verb-weighted non-topic vector in which only the non-topics preferred by the verb are emphasized, such as the food topic in eat-weighted apple and the small object topic in the hold-weighted apple. In contrast, we can see the topic distribution in want-weighted apple is relatively less changed. This is because the verb want doesn't have very specific constraints for the topics by which apple is modeled. Next, to investigate when and where in the brain the meaning computation between a verb and its object noun happens, we adopted a representational similarity analysis, RSA, to test the topic vectors against the source-localized brain data. So on the one hand, we can calculate the dissimilarity geometry using the topic vectors, which we call model RDM. Each element in this matrix is a pairwise dissimilarity between two topic vectors. On the other hand, we can also calculate the dissimilarity geometry using the brain activity at a certain location within a certain time window during the speech, which we call data RDM. So by correlating a certain model RDM and the many data RDMs derived from the spatiotemporally resolved brain activity, we can tell when and where the information captured by the model is represented in the brain. So now we have two competing models for the meaning computation between a verb and its object noun. One is the context-independent model of non-semantics based on the original non-topic vector. The other is the verb constraint noun model. It predicts that the meaning of a noun is strongly affected by the meaning of the preceding word. Then we can directly test these two models against the EMEG data recorded during the noun is heard. As shown here, we found no effects for the context-independent non-semantics. In contrast, we see strong effects of the verb constraint non-semantics in the left inferior frontal gyrus and the wide range of the left temporal cortex after the noun is recognized. So here, RP is short for recognition point. So the time point in which, in speech, when the target word is uniquely recognized. So we also developed a model of the interaction between the verb semantic constraints and the non-semantics by partialing out both non-topic RDM and the verb topic RDM from the verb-weighted non-topic RDM. So this model shows significant effects in the left inferior frontal gyrus only, suggesting its role in selecting the non-semantics constrained by the verb to achieve the composed meaning. So well, RSA can, so these RSA results tell us when and where the information captured by the model emerge in the brain. We want to further ask how this happens. So to this end, we conducted a connectivity analysis to investigate the dynamic interaction between brain regions involved in this process based on their spatial temporal patterns. That is the LMTG and the LFG that give effects of verb-weighted non-semantics. So the logic here is quite like a Granger causality. So specifically, we take the spatial temporal patterns of regions A and B. So if region A has a causal effects on B, then the activity in A at a previous time point is expected to explain the current activity in B better than simply using the previous activity of B alone. So using their data RDMs, we quantified this relationship through using partial correlation. So with these methods, we found that LMTG is constantly and rapidly sending information to LFG with a short delay of about 20 milliseconds, while the pattern of information flow from LFG to LMTG is featured with long-lasting effects as reflected by the long diagonal patterns. So these results suggest that LMTG rapidly retrieves and delivers lexical properties of the incoming word, incoming noun to LFG. Meanwhile, it's also subject to the prediction from the LFG since the noun onset. So this study shows the meaning of a word could be strongly affected by the prior context arguing for flexible meaning. And such a contextualized word interpretation is achieved through top-down and bottom-up information flows characterized by distinct temporal patterns in the left frontal temporal network, with the role of the left FG in predicting based on the prior context. Okay, now let's move on to the second study. So in daily life, we hardly communicate by saying only two words. A sentence is the smallest unit to convey meaning or message level information. So here we focus on how the brain builds a structure interpretation from a sentence as it unfolds word by word. Let's have a look at this example. Imagine we hear someone saying the dog walked in the park. I guess for most of us, it's perfectly fine to consider this as a complete sentence and put a full stop at the end. So this gives an active interpretation in which the dog is the agent that conducts the action. So the dog walked by itself, and the walk is the main verb of this sentence. However, it's also possible and grammatically correct to have a completely different passive interpretation. In this case, dog is the patient that undergoes the action. So the dog was walked by someone else, and the walk is the head of a reduced relative clause rather than the main verb. So this example suggests that the online interpretation of a sentence is probabilistic, but the question is, what are the driving factors underlying this probabilistic interpretation? Let's consider these two sentences. They only differ in the first verb. One is found, the other is walked. They have the same sentential structure in terms of the whole sentence, so both give a passive interpretation. But by the end of park, the passive interpretation would be more preferred in the dog found in the park, while the active interpretation would be more preferred in the dog walked in the park. So this is because find is a highly transitive verb. It's often immediately followed by an object noun. So the absence of a highly expected object noun will make a listener prefer to interpret found as a passive verb. On the other hand, walk has low transitivity. So the following prepositional phrase in the park fits its intransitive use very well. However, when the actual main verb was covered is heard, the listener will immediately resolve the intended structure, and the passive interpretation is confirmed in both sentences. So in this example, the transitivity of the first verb plays an important role for the preference for one of the two plausible structural interpretations. Now let's consider these two sentences. When people hear the dog found or the car found, both active and passive interpretations are plausible for the dog found, but only the passive interpretation seems plausible for the car found. Because the car is inanimate, and it's very unlikely an agent that performs the action of finding something. So as shown here, the structured interpretation also depends on the semantic role preference of the subject noun. That is, how likely the subject noun performs the action as an agent or undergoes the action as a patient. So this is related to our broad word knowledge. From all these examples, we know that the online construction of a sentence structure depends on various types of probabilistic constraints. They can be either linguistic or non-linguistic. Depending on the specific context, different sources of constraint will be more or less decisive in selecting one of the grammatically correct structures developed over time. And it is the interpretive coherence of these constraints that is the basis for successful language comprehension. So in the final interpretation, all the constraints point to the same direction. So this is a widely accepted view in cognitive science, known as the constraint-based approach to sentence processing. In light of this view, we investigate how a structured interpretation emerges in the brain as the sentence unfolds word by word. So in this experiment, we constructed 60 sites of sentences. The two target sentences in each site only differ in the transitivity of the first word. That is the high trans sentence and the low trans sentence, while the subject noun varies across different sentence sites. And again, we use the simultaneous EG and MEG to record participants' brain activity while they were listening to these sentences without any explicit task. Then the critical question is how to model the structure of an unfolding sentence. As shown on the left, in computational linguistics, a symbolic path tree is often used to represent the structure of a sentence. Although it can tell the difference between the two structural interpretations, it has nothing to do with the specific contents in each sentence. It will make no difference if we replace dog with cat, which means that it can't tell the probability of a possible interpretation given the specific contents in a sentence. But the human online structure interpretation is indeed probabilistic. As shown by the results from continuation pre-tests, participants were required to provide a continuation to complete the sentence given the prompt. Here, the less often a main verb in the continuation after the prepositional phrase, the more favorable the active interpretation, vice versa for the passive interpretation. So we need to develop incremental structural measures that consider the multifaceted constraints based on the specific contents in each sentence, such as the subject-noun semantic role preference and the verb transitivity. To this end, we adopted a large-scale pre-trained language NN called BERT and extracted quantitative measures of sentential structures from its hidden states. So BERT has already shown close to human performance in some language comprehension tasks, and is used by Google for a better understanding of search queries. So this is mainly due to its ability to generate deep contextualized representations given the specific contents in a sentence. So therefore, BERT provides a potential solution to quantitatively model the probabilistic online interpretation of the sentence structure, which can be tested against the corresponding brain data. Following a previous study, we adopted a structural probing model through which the past steps of each word in a sentence can be reconstructed from their hidden states in each layer of BERT. In other words, the training process aims at finding a linear transform to be applied to the hidden state vectors of each word in a sentence. So the L2 norm of each word's transformed vector is an estimate of this word's depth in the corresponding dependency path tree. So once the structural probing model is trained, we input each sentence word by word, similarly to how it is received by a human listener. By doing this, BERT returns an incremental path steps vector for each sentence fragment. So the number of dimensions increases as the sentence unfolds. More importantly, we found that BERT path steps seems indicative of the preferred structural interpretation. As we can see here, the path steps of the first verb found increases as the sentence unfolds, approaching the passive interpretation. So this matches very well with the human incremental structural interpretation of the same sentence. So as a result, we got incremental structural measures as the sentence unfolds word by word. And the BERT path steps of words at the same position form the distribution. It ranges around the corresponding context-free path steps of either the passive or the active interpretation, which are all integers. So this suggests that BERT path steps may be sensitive to the specific contents in each sentence. Moreover, BERT path steps of the same word is also updated as the sentence unfolds, suggesting that the upcoming contents affect the interpretation of previous words. So this is also a very important feature of incremental speech comprehension. To better visualize the incremental structure interpretation by BERT, we plotted each sentence as it unfolds in the BERT model space, consisting of the path steps of the first three words. Because the dependency between the subject noun and the first verb is key to the structural interpretation here. We also plotted the corresponding context-free path steps vectors in this space, so the circle and the triangle. And they can be considered as landmarks that help us make sense of BERT structural measures, so that the trajectory of each sentence tells us how its interpretation evolves as the sentence unfolds, The smaller its distance from one of the two landmarks, the more preferred the interpretation it represents. So in the upper right panel, we can see considerably intertwined trajectories of individual high trans and low trans sentences, suggesting that bird structural measures are sensitive to the specific content in each sentence. And the interpretation of these two types of sentences is probabilistic rather than dichotomic. But collectively, as shown by the median trajectory in the lower right panel, like human listeners, birds also initially prefer the active interpretation for low trans sentences approaching the active landmark on the left. However, with the appearance of the actual main verb, low trans sentences turn around to the passive landmark, while the high trans sentences unidirectionally move towards the passive interpretation until the end of the sentence. So these results show a very good behavioral alignment between birds and humans in incremental structural interpretations. Moreover, as predicted by the constraint-based approach, bird structural measures also conform to the multifaceted probabilistic constraints that are considered by human listeners. Their movements in the model space are correlated with subject non-semantic role preference and the first verb transitivity estimated from large corpora. We also quantified the interpretive coherence between subject noun and the first verb by the passive and active interpretation index. So the idea is like this: both high subject noun agenthood and high first verb intransitivity tend to give an active interpretation when the prepositional phrase is heard. For example, the dog walked in the park. On the other hand, both high subject noun patienthood and high first verb transitivity tend to give a passive interpretation. So we found bird structural measures correlate well with this passive and active interpretation index, capturing the interpretive coherence between these two types of lexical constraints. Besides, bird structural measures also directly correlate with human interpretations derived from behavioral tests, such as the main verb probability in the sentence continuation pretest. So next, using RC, we tested bird structural measures against the corresponding brain data to investigate the neurodynamics of incremental structural interpretation. In light of the constraint-based approach and the previous behavioral results, we combined the two types of sentence as one group. We found the effects of bird structural measures as the sentence unfolds. So at the first verb, when the initial structural interpretation is established, at the preposition, when the structural interpretation starts to be updated, and at the main verb, when the intended structure is eventually resolved. So the three epochs were aligned to the onset of the three words separately. The brain figures shows the accumulated effects within an epoch. That is the sum of above threshold t-values. The heat map and the curves below show the temporal dynamics of different brain regions of each hemisphere. So here, UP is the time point in speech when the word being heard can be uniquely recognized. The gray shade indicate one standard deviation among items. So the results in the lower panel also show the transition from the initially preferred active interpretation to the later resolved passive interpretation in the brain. Most regions are found in the bilateral frontal temporal regions, which is the classical language network we know. Moreover, significant effects shift from bilateral hemispheres to the left hemisphere as the sentence unfolds and the structure becomes more complex, particularly the left prefrontal and the lateral regions. So these results depict the millisecond by millisecond dynamic process of structural interpretation in the brain. And meanwhile, they also reveal a robust neural alignment between the structural representations in the human brain and the bird. Well, in this experiment, the potential ambiguity between a passive and an active interpretation is a matter of whether the first verb is considered as a passive verb or the main verb. So we want to know how this potential ambiguity is resolved in the brain with the appearance of the actual main verb. To this end, we use past steps of the first verb, which is the most indicative of the structural interpretation. This is also constantly updated as the sentence unfolds. So a first verb depth close to 0 indicates an active interpretation, while the first verb depth close to 2 indicates a passive interpretation. We tested the change of the first verb past steps and the updated first verb past steps in the main verb epoch. They indicate separately the resolution process and the resolved results. So significant feats of the change of the first verb past steps, which captures the resolution process, emerged in the left posterior temporal regions upon the main verb recognition point, and then extended to more anterior temporal regions. Following the main verb offset, the declining effects of the first verb past steps change seamlessly overlapped with the arising effects of the updated first verb past steps in the left anterior temporal regions. See the yellow regions in the brain figures, which then propagated to the left FG and the bilateral temporal regions. So these results show the neurodynamics underpinning the update of structural interpretation during incremental speech comprehension. Finally, according to the constraint-based hypothesis, it is the interpretive coherence of different constraints that underpins the emerging structural interpretation. So here we want to investigate the relationship between the interpretive coherence and the emergent sentential structure in the brain. Again, we focus on the main verb epoch. So at the main verb onset, when the main verb is not recognized yet, both active and passive interpretation could be held in a listener's brain. So we derived a non-directional interpretive index. It unifies the active interpretation index and the passive interpretation index, and captures the interpretive coherence regardless of which one is preferred, no matter it's passive or active. We can see this non-directional interpretation index shows effects immediately after the main verb onset and disappeared upon the recognition point of the main verb. During this time period, a listener may reevaluate the interpretation held in mind because they realize that the sentence is not finished yet, no matter it's passive interpretation or active interpretation. Significant effects are found in both hemispheres, and the most involved regions are the left ATL, IPL, and the precuneus, which fall in the default network. So this is quite interesting, given the recent claims that the default mode network integrates external information with internal prior knowledge to make sense of an external input, such as speech. And with the recognition of the main verb, we found the effects of the passive interpretation index for the finally resolved passive interpretation in the right hemisphere, which appeared immediately after the recognition of the main verb. Moreover, these effects occur at almost the same time with the effects of the sentence structure modeled by the Bird past steps vector. Although significant effects are found in different hemispheres, so we want to further ask, what is the relationship between these two sets of effects? So to answer this question, we decompose the whole brain RC feeds into a few components using non-negative matrix factorization and conducted granular causality analysis with the time courses of these different components, these two sets of components. So significant GC connections are only found from the effects of the passive index to those of the Bird past steps vector, suggesting that interpretive coherence indeed facilitates the emergent sentential structure in the brain. So this finding provides a piece of empirical evidence for the constraint-based approach to online sentence processing. So to wrap it up, we discovered both behavior and the neural element between the human brain and the ANS in finding the structure of a sentence as it unfolds word by word. So this also reveals the neurodynamics of incremental structural interpretation in the brain. Moreover, this study provides the level of neurocomputational specificity required to elucidate both the neurodynamics of incremental speech comprehension and the parallels between brain and ANS in language comprehension. So in our studies, we combine the spatiotemporally resolved brain data and the computational language models using multivariate RSA, which enables us to probe directly the neurodynamics of incremental processes as each word is heard and rapidly integrated into a coherent interpretation. This set of methods can be used to investigate the neurodynamics of different dimensions of language comprehension by focusing on the specific contents and the representations activated in the brain, the dynamic spatial temporal relationship between them, and their evolution over time. So when considered as plausible brain computational models and tested against brain data with neurocomputational specificity, ANNs can link computational theory and the neurobiological infrastructure, providing new insights into human intelligence and the cognitive functions. So finally, I'd like to thank Professor Lorraine Taylor, who is the head of our lab, and Professor William Marshall Wilson, who is a lifelong collaborator of Lorraine in both research and life. They laid the cornerstone of everything in the lab. I also want to thank my colleagues, Billy, Alex, Hun, Yuxing, and Barry, without whom none of these studies would ever be possible. Okay, thank you very much for your attention.
Wow, thank you so much, both of you. That was very, very interesting talk. Thank you so much. So I guess we can have a couple of questions now. Lorraine, I think you have to leave in a minute, right? You said? Oh, you're muted. Let me see. Yeah, perfect. Now we can hear you. We couldn't hear you a second ago.
Hello.
Okay. Lorraine, do you still have a minute?
Yeah.
For some questions? Okay, perfect.
That
so,
question goes to Bingjiang.
Yeah, so Yixingli, maybe do you want to ask your question yourself?
Who, me? Oh, sorry.
No, Yixingli ask a question.
Yeah.
Hi.
Hi, thank you very much for this very interesting talk. So I'm just curious, so how does this BERT parse depth vector different from like the traditional dependency depth? Like, yeah, so why do you need to use this vector instead of just using the?
Because as shown in my slides, so the traditional parse depths, for example, dependency parse depths, they are always integers. It has nothing to do with the content in a sentence. But according to the constraint-based approach to sentence processing, you need to consider the contents, how these subtle lexical properties affect your comprehension of the ongoing sentence. And ANNs like BERT, because they are, I guess the achievements they have now is largely due to their ability to generate a very deep contextualized representation of the input. So presumably those representation, those contextualized interpretation incorporate such lexical properties which are needed to provide the variance that can be correlated with brain data. Because our brain responds to different words differently, even though the sentence have the same structure.
So like in this vector, it also contains like semantic information or
yeah, but you need to find it by yourself. Yeah. You need to use some explanatory models like measures, you know what they mean, and correlate that with the BERT parse depths. It's like you are trying to open the black box of BERT first, and then use that to test against another black box, which is our brain.
Yeah. So from what I understand, you did a regression, right? Yeah. So it should be like the relevant. So in this vector, it should be relevant to depths.
Yes.
Instead of like other semantic, right?
It's
so
like So for example, like in the traditional parse depths, as I showed in my example, the dog found in the park. So when found is considered as a main verb, it has a past depth of 0. When it's considered as a passive verb or the head of the reduced relative clause, it has a depth of 2. So, but the bird past depth of the first verb gives you a distribution which ranges between 0 and 2, and it may reflect the interpretive preference given the specific content in each sentence. So that's why we can then build a model RDM using RSA to test whether such interpretive preference is correlated to brain activity.
Oh, another question is, so from what I understand, BERT is like bi-directional, and
yes.
it doesn't parse like a sentence word by word, right?
And
that's different from human language processing. So I just
yeah, actually, we first tried GPT. So because GPT is a unidirection, but the trouble is that like the garden path sentence we use in the experiment. So basically, people may reanalyze the sentence given the later input. But for GPT, which has just a unidirection from left to right, the model never updates the previous repetition, the repetition of the previous word. So that's a trouble. And then we use BERT, and we try to model incrementality by input the sentence word by word. So force the BERT model to give us a representation for even just a fragment of sentence, just like us. So when we hear sentence word by word, we never hear it as a whole at once. Yeah.
I see. Have you compared like different layers of the BERT?
Yes, actually that's a good question, because for the version we use, it has 24 layers, but we trained the probing model and chose the one which shows the best performance to test against the brain data. Because previous studies have shown that the shallow layers and the deepest layers of NNs are balanced by how they pick up information from the input, and balanced by the training task, by the task they were trained to do. So which is not what we do. We don't pick up information from numbers. We don't just do the task like predicting next word. So, but the internal layers, and it shows a quite a good fit with brain activity. So this has been showed by a previous study.
Yeah, but so that's different from like the CNN models to simulate visual processing, because like CNN model, they look at different layers, right? So here we don't have this information.
But actually there's quite a lot of studies, especially many preprint papers. They correlate the hidden states of BERT or GPT or other language model with brain activity. But here I think we move a small step forward by extracting the specific information from the model. So here the past steps, and test that against the brain data, so we can be more specific. That's why we say that we need a certain level of neurocomputational specificity to use such ANNs to help us understand how the brain comprehends language.
Okay. And also you tested on other constructions, not just passive and active? Because here the variation is small, right?
Yeah,
so
yeah.
Have like more, yeah.
Yeah, we just, for now, we just test these types of sentences. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Are there any other questions? If you haven't typed up yet, you can also just put Q or QJ in the Zoom chat and then just speak up yourself. Okay. Maybe I have one more question, actually more on the conceptual, not on the technical level. Okay. So I was the whole time thinking you're talking about context, but on the other side, you're also talking about the semantic network, and especially Bingjiang in your first study with the eat and the hold. And there's more and more studies now describing the semantic network in graph-based approaches in terms of the small worldness, where you have few words connected to many and many words connected to few, actually. And then I was thinking the whole time, in what sense can you actually disentangle the overall context from the semantic network? So eat and apple being in one semantic network, that making up the context. But so what is actually the conceptual difference between the context and just the semantic network? Do you know what I mean?
I guess probably you mean something like, so I know a model like it's which called the concept net. So you have links between different, it's like you have so I think it's like you have links between eat, the verb eat, and all kinds of food. And in that, it's like a more a general or a general way to describe semantics, I guess. But in our case, we try to do this in quite a different way, as you have seen in my slides. So we just focus on the and also, I mean, I think it's for me, I think it's a more of a question about the model you use, because what kind of question you can address is basically based on the model you use. So, so I think because the questions you can address to a large extent is dependent by it depends on the model you use. So in our case, by using topic modeling. So although you can see they are different interpretable topics, but they do not provide such a, as you mentioned, a network-like representation of semantics. So which I think, so I mean, I don't think that the meaning of individual words are isolated from each other. So of course they must form a network. So I think it would be interesting to test models such as concept net against the brain data to see whether they have different brain effects when compared with the effects of models like topic modeling or word-to-vec, which seems to give you the context-independent representation of a word, because you consider every occurrence in the corpus. And in our case, we just manually manipulate the non-topic writer and the verb topic writer to model the process of meaning computation. But for the each vector itself, it's just a context-independent representation because it considers all the context. So it's just a different way to model semantics, I guess. But it would be interesting to test a model such as concept net.
Yeah, it would be very interesting to look at the graph-based approaches where you see the with hold, you have longer distances to apple, whereas with eat, you have very short distances.
Yeah. You predict the same outcome though.
Yeah.
Which could be wrong, of course.
Yeah, I was just wondering if you have thought about that, as there's so much new research now on these descriptions of the semantic networks.
Yeah, actually, one colleague in the lab, he's using concept net and trying to do some stuff, and we hope we can soon get the paper off.
Very well, thank you.
Thank you.
There's also another question by Peter Linz. Would you like to speak up yourself?
Well, I can just say I found this all very interesting, but there's a lot of information to absorb. And so I'm wondering, you know, I'd like to go back and maybe look at the slides some more, or look at
sure.
Or at some published papers you have that present some of this information so that I can absorb it in a little more depth.
So, so do you want to see some slides or?
No, I'm talking about not right now, but where can I get it offline?
I see. So, so the first paper has been published, and the second one, I think we'll soon upload it to a preprint server very soon. And you can find the publications in our lab website.
Okay.
So which is csl.cycle.cam.ac.uk, I guess.
csl.psycho.
CSLB, Center for Language Brain Language
CSLB.
Center for Speech Language and Center for Speech Language and the Brain. Sorry, Lorraine.
CSLB.psycho.
.com.cam, Cambridge, CAM. Or maybe I can type it in the chat so you can see it.
Okay. Great. And I guess this recording is available somewhere. I don't know about the slides. Okay, great. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm afraid I need to go.
Lorraine, do you have time for one more question from us? So
Yeah, okay.
we usually, at the end of every lecture series, we always ask one question to the senior, one question to the junior researcher. And Lorraine, the question for you is, what do you think is the most important challenge for the field for the next 5 years? Not an easy question, I know.
I think the answer, the answer to that will very much depend on one's interests. Well, as I was saying, I suppose, I would like to see more mechanistic, that is, more detailed neurocomputational accounts of the phenomena that we're interested in, that are explanatory accounts of language processing, production or comprehension or whatever. I just think we're a bit light, we're a bit light touched. I mean, we find a region of the brain active or something, but it's not really very explanatory at the moment, I think.
Okay, thank you very much for that. Bingjiang, the question for you then is, how do you think you can contribute to solving that challenge that Lorraine has just mentioned?
Oh, he can do that.
I think Lorraine has already gave an answer in his introduction to this talk. So basically, on the one hand, we need spatial temporally resolved brain recordings. So we need to measure the brain data millisecond by millisecond with better spatial and temporal resolutions. On the other hand, we need computational models that explicitly capture the contents of different aspects of language comprehension. And with those models, we can, because only with these models, we can ask specific questions. So what kind of combination the brain is doing at a certain moment in a certain region. So I think by combining the spatial temporally resolved brain activity and different computational models, we can have a one step further to address those challenging and also important questions about human language comprehension.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much, the two of you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Angela,
Bye,
nice
everyone.
to see you.
Bye-bye.
Nice to see you.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.